Most franchise founders believe growth comes from adding more locations. And in the early stage, that belief feels true. Revenue goes up, the brand expands, franchisees are excited, momentum feels real. But what many founders eventually discover is that after a certain point, adding locations stops creating leverage and starts creating drag. That moment is what I call the franchise growth trap. It's subtle at first, which is exactly why it's so dangerous, because on the surface, the business still looks successful. I'm Justin Kaiser, and I've spent the last 24 years building businesses, including building a franchise brand from scratch and scaling it to over 100 franchise territories in just 3 years before an acquisition. And after working with founders at every stage, from first location to national expansion, what I've learned is this: unit count alone does not equal scale, and growth without architecture eventually collapses under its own weight. In the early days of franchising, growth feels simple because the founder fills every gap. Training may be incomplete, but the founder jumps in. Support may be reactive, but the founder answers to the call. Culture may be undefined, but the founder's presence keeps things aligned. This creates the illusion that the system itself is strong, when in reality, the system is borrowing strength from the founder. And as long as growth is slow, that illusion holds. But as the brand grows, something subtle but critical starts to change. Support requests increase faster than revenue. Decisions that used to be easy now take longer. Standards that once felt obvious now need enforcement. Franchisees begin asking questions that don't have clear answers. And slowly, the founder starts feeling pulled back into the day-to-day operations, even though the business is bigger on paper. This is usually the moment when growth stops feeling freeing and starts feeling heavy. At this point, most founders misdiagnose the problem. They assume it's a people issue, an execution issue, a discipline issue. So they respond with effort. More calls, more hires, more meetings, more oversight, more personal involvement. But effort can't replace architecture. And without architecture, growth doesn't create leverage. It creates complexity. The real issue is that most franchise systems are built to sell locations, not to support scale. Sales systems are built early because they drive visible growth. Infrastructure systems get delayed because they don't feel urgent. Training is good enough at 5 units. Support is manageable at 10, but standards can be enforced informally at 20. But somewhere between 10 and 50 locations, depending on the concept, those shortcuts begin to compound. And at that stage, every new location introduces more exceptions instead of reinforcing the system. Knowledge lives in people instead of documentation. Decisions flow upward instead of outward, and the founder quietly becomes the bottleneck again, not because they want to be, but because the system has nowhere else for problems to go. Growth continues, but leverage disappears. This is the core misunderstanding about scale. Scale is not about doing more, it's about deciding less. True scale reduces the number of decisions required per unit as the system grows. When every new location adds new questions, approvals, and founder involvement, the business is not scaling, it's just expanding with friction. There's also a psychological component here that founders rarely talk about. Growth feels validating. Unit count is easy to measure. It's visible. It feels like progress. Infrastructure, on the other hand, is invisible. No one applauds better documentation. No one celebrates fewer decisions. No one congratulates you for investing in support systems before they're obviously needed. So founders naturally chase what feels rewarding, even when it quietly undermines long-term value. This is also where investors start to see problems long before founders do, because investors don't evaluate franchise brands on how fast they're growing. They evaluate them based on how stable they are under growth. They look for repeatability, predictability, replaceability, systems that function without heroics. And when growth increases risk instead of reducing it, valuation suffers regardless of unit count. The franchise brands that break through this trap think differently. They stop measuring success by how many locations they've sold and start measuring it by how strong their systems are. They ask harder questions. How many decisions does each new unit require? And how much support does each franchisee need after stabilization? How dependent is performance on founder judgment? How quickly can a new operator become competent without intervention? They understand that infrastructure must be built before it feels necessary. Support teams must be trained before demand overwhelms them. Leadership layers must be installed before the founder becomes the constraint. Documentation must be complete before inconsistency becomes visible. And while this feels like slowing down, it's actually the only way to protect your growth. Because growth without structure creates fragility. Structure without growth creates readiness. And when two finally meet, real scale becomes possible. At Empire Franchising, this is exactly the shift that we help founders with. We move brands from growth-driven thinking to platform-driven thinking. We help design infrastructure that supports scale instead of chasing unit count without support. Because the goal isn't to add more locations. The goal is to build a machine where every new location strengthens the brand instead of stressing it. If your brand is growing but feels heavier instead of freer, if adding locations no longer feels like leverage, or if you're not sure whether your system is actually built to scale, that's exactly what we work through in our growth strategy sessions. This isn't a sales call. It's a working session where we look at your business honestly. We assess your architecture and identify what needs to be built next so that growth creates strength instead of stress. If you want clarity on whether your franchise is designed to scale or how to redesign it so it is, schedule a growth strategy session with us. That conversation alone can change the entire future of your brand.